this is not possible. And I'm like, DaBaby, this is not possible. And I'm like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like, actually, DaBaby. So I'm like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like telling myself, I'm actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, DaBaby, you know, that's kind of DaBaby of you. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. If you really are DaBaby, then I'm actually DaBaby. And so I'm looking in the mirror, right? Like I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, okay, DaBaby. Are you really DaBaby? And he's like, yeah, I'm DaBaby. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. If you really are DaBaby, you know, like maybe you are DaBaby. And you're like, alright, DaBaby. So I'm kind of DaBaby, you know. I'm like, alright, DaBaby, you know, I'm kind of DaBaby with you. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. You know, I'm kind of DaBaby. He's like, alright, DaBaby. You know,
Love with the title grow.
I'm like DaBaby, right? I'm like, alright, DaBaby. I'm like, DaBaby. I'm like DaBaby, right? I'm like, actually DaBaby. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like telling myself I'm actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. You know, it's kind of DaBaby. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. So I'm like DaBaby, you know, and I'm like, alright, DaBaby. If you really are DaBaby, you know, I'm actually DaBaby, right? So I'm like, okay, DaBaby.
I can't keep fucking do this. Is this a loop WTF?
DaBaby, right? So I'm like, oh my gosh, man. I'm like, shit, DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, bro. It's DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, guys. It's really DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, bro, it's DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, bro, it's DaBaby. And he's like, alright, DaBaby. And he's like, okay, DaBaby. If you really are DaBaby, then I'm actually DaBaby. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. So he's like, nah, I'm not gonna shut up. Because you know why? Because I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby, like I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, it's DaBaby, guys, it's DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, guys, it's DaBaby. So I'm like telling myself, I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like, actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, okay, DaBaby. If you really are DaBaby, you know, I'm actually DaBaby. Well, I'm DaBaby, right? So I'm telling myself, I'm actually DaBaby! So I'm like looking in the mirror, right? I'm actually DaBaby, right? So I'm like, okay, DaBaby. If you do this right, I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like, okay, DaBaby. So he's like, alright, DaBaby. And he's like, alright, DaBaby. I'm like, actually DaBaby. So I'm like, tier 5 on this field upgrade because I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like telling myself I'm actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, okay, DaBaby. You know, this is kind of a DaBaby moment of you, and you know, and I'm actually DaBaby though. So I'm like the other guy, right? He's saying that he's DaBaby, and I'm like, nah, I'm actually DaBaby. And I'm actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. And he's like, alright, DaBaby. You know, I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby, that's not DaBaby, that's DaBaby, and that's my baby. And I'm like, okay, DaBaby. Maybe I'm DaBaby. And he's like, yeah, you're DaBaby. And he's like, okay, DaBaby. The mirror right now, right? And I'm like, okay, DaBaby. Is that really DaBaby? And he's like, yeah, I'm DaBaby. I'm like, oh my gosh, let's go. And I'm like, DaBaby, is that really you? And he's like, DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, guys, I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh.
And how do you
and I'm like,
with
DaBaby, right? And I'm like, DaBaby. He's like, oh my gosh, and I'm DaBaby. And he's like, megatons? What megatons? I don't see anything, because I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like, DaBaby, I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, bruh, DaBaby. And he's like, dog, DaBaby. And he's like, I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby, I'm gone, DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, bruh. And he's like, DaBaby, I'm actually DaBaby, bruh. And I'm like, just chilling here. Oh my gosh, I'm DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby? No, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like going on for like maybe an hour, and I'm like, okay, DaBaby, this is kind of a bro moment, you know. And he's like, you know, it's kind of like DaBaby of you. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby, you know, I'm gonna get tier 100 real quick. And I'm like, DaBaby, maybe not. And I'm like, okay, DaBaby. So this guy right here, he's actually DaBaby himself. And I got like DaBaby, you know, and I got the ray gun of round 3. And I'm like, DaBaby, you can't use the ray gun.
Roll pedestrian.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, bruh. And I'm like, DaBaby.
Is it
And
2x2?
he's like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like, this is such an easy thing to do. And he's like, okay, round 200. Okay, divine then, DaBaby.
XP.
And he's like, oh my gosh, bro. Is that actually DaBaby? And he's like, yeah, that's actually DaBaby with XP, bro. And I'm like, oh my gosh, bro. It's like DaBaby, you know? And I'm like, DaBaby. Oh my gosh, bro. And he's like, that's actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, bro, moment. That's actually kind of like DaBaby, though. And I'm like, DaBaby, right? So I'm like saying, like, I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, and he's actually DaBaby. And I'm like, maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. And I'm like, nah, I don't know, man. And I'm like, I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, bro, moment, I'm about to hit 1,000,000. I already run to round 90 in like 2 hours. And I'm like, is that really you, DaBaby? And he's like, yes, it's DaBaby. And I'm like, okay, now I'm looking in the mirror, right? That I'm actually DaBaby. He's like, DaBaby, I gotta tell you a story about DaBaby. And he's like, okay, DaBaby, are you really DaBaby? And he's like, yeah, I'm DaBaby. And he's like, alright, I'm DaBaby, right? I'm like, actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, alright, DaBaby, are
I
you
think
really
you should go
DaBaby?
to a doctor.
I'm DaBaby, right? So I'm like, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like telling myself I'm actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, actually DaBaby. So I'm like doing my work now, right? And I'm like, okay, DaBaby, maybe you can do this work. And I'm like, actually, yeah, I'm gonna do it. Cause I'm actually DaBaby. And I'm like, okay, DaBaby, you know, it's pretty good of you. And I'm like, okay, DaBaby, you got this. And I'm like, DaBaby? Oh my god. And I'm like, okay, DaBaby, I won't, you know, and cause you know, that's kind of mean, you know, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm actually DaBaby, and I'm like, oh my, I'm DaBaby, right, and then like, oh my gosh, bro, I'm actually DaBaby, and he's like, oh my gosh, I need help, right, and I'm like, nah, I don't need help, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like, I'm DaBaby, right? I'm like, I'm actually DaBaby, and I'm like, I'm actually DaBaby, right? So I'm looking in the mirror. And I'm
also,
like,
what happens if you use another toxic growth?
So I'm like, I'm DaBaby, right? And I'm like,
please get some help. I am just trying to look out for you.
So I'm like talking to my therapist now, right? And he's telling me that I'm actually DaBaby, right? And he's like, DaBaby? I don't think you're DaBaby. And I'm like, I'm DaBaby! And I'm like, okay, I leave. I walk out of the room, you know, I pay him, of course. Even though I only paid him $1, and I'm like, okay, 1 minute of the time, alright, 1 minute of your time, okay, so that's $1, right? So I'm like, alright, DaBaby, you know, I'm actually DaBaby, so I'm like, alright, DaBaby, you know, I'm talking to another therapist now, and he's saying, what's your problem? And I'm saying, like, I'm actually DaBaby, you know, people are saying I'm schizophrenic, and I'm like, nah, I'm not schizophrenic, and I'm like, he's the therapist, right? So he's like, nah, you're not schizophrenic, because you're talking to me. And he's like, oh yeah, you're fake, cause you're DaBaby. And I'm like, oh my gosh, bro, I'm actually DaBaby. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby, round 79. You know, I'm like, okay, DaBaby, maybe it should get to around 100, you know. And I'm like, nah, let's get to around 1000. And I'm like, DaBaby. And I'm like, oh my gosh, bro, I'm actually DaBaby. And I'm like, bro, moment. And I'm like, I'm DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby?
You never answered my question.
What's your question? We use another toxic growth. And he's like, nah, if you use another toxic growth, you can't. Because you can't use it because it's the part of the thing. And I'm like, I'm actually DaBaby. And I'm like, yeah, I'm actually DaBaby. And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. You can't use it because you can't deploy it. It won't work once the glitch is already here. So I'm like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's DaBaby. See my the bottom right, my toxic growth. See how the bar's not going up? That means I can't use it. It's glitched.
Why not?
It's glitched because I can't use it. Every time I try to use it, it says what do you call it?
Yeah,
you can't use it. Unable to deploy here, that's what it will say. I don't want to risk pressing it now because I'm already tired. But I'm like actually the baby, right? So I'm like telling myself I'm actually the baby, right? And this will get patched within 3 days at the very most. And I'm like, I'm gonna exploit this to its very maximum potential. So I'm leaving a mini fan here next to my PS4
Where did you
Slim,
find
and
this
I'm
stuff?
like the baby, right? And I'm like, okay, the baby. I'll put it here, everything here, and the thing is so hot, man. I put a can next to it, and it is burning right now. Oh, it's not really burning. Oh, actually, this is not that bad. It's not that hot. I could run this for like another day or two. I'll probably have to turn off my TV, you know, because I'm actually the baby. And he's like, the baby! I'm like, oh my gosh. I found it on a YouTube video. And I'm like telling myself, I'm actually kind of like the baby, you know. And
What
he's like,
level are you now?
and I'm like, Prestige 2, almost Prestige 3. Actually, I'll probably check right now. I'm actually Prestige. Oh, I'm still Prestige 2, I'm pretty sure. I'm level 66. I don't know if that's Prestige 3 or 2. And I'm like telling myself, I got 7,000 you know, parts, and I got 3,570 hot materials. And he's like, the baby! I'm level 66, by the way. And he's like, oh my gosh, I'm the baby. And he's like, the baby! Oh my gosh, bruh. And he's like, the baby. And he's like, oh my gosh, bruh. Like, look at
What
that,
are
look at
you
the
standing on?
And I'm like standing on the middle of the air because you can see my legs floating. And I'm like, the baby! And I'm like, oh my gosh, bruh. I'm actually the baby. He's like, oh my gosh, bro, I'm actually the baby. He's like, I'm actually the baby. So I'm about to reach
So what is the
Prestige 4
whole point on
because
this?
I want to. So the whole point of doing this is getting XP, bro, and crystals for zombies, right? And you also get the battle pass points. So if you reach tier
I am
90,
guessing you will be doing this
around-
for hours.
so I'm like telling myself I've only done this for like 2 hours now. I did it for like an hour and 30 minutes before, and I got to around 90 or 80. Or no, 90 I mean. I think I did it for like, cause I did it really early.
That
so it
is
was really
day.
fast here. So it's like around 90. But this one is kind of screwed up, so this one's a lot slower. Especially the megatons. See, like this guy right here? Barely kill this guy. See? Look how many shots. So I get the flawless, refined, and another refined one. So I'm like chilling. You know, because I'm actually the baby. So I'm like gonna get like 8 tiers if I do like another maybe 40. Another 40. I'm gonna go to
Is it difficult to do?
279. And I'm like, yes, it's very difficult to do because they tried patching it, bruh. They tried patching it. They just made it harder to jump on this thing, man. It's so hard. Oh my gosh, man, it's so hard. But you gotta do everything correctly, man. You gotta put it in this spot. You gotta do everything, man. It's so hard. Cause I'm actually the baby. That's how I did it. Cause I'm actually the baby. I told the game I was the baby. I went tryhard mode, and then I'm like, I'm the baby. And then I got into the spot. It's kind of hard to do, but it's like so worth after you do everything, man. And I'm like, I'm the baby, right? So I'm like, baby. So I'm telling myself, I'm actually the baby, right? So I'm like, the baby? I don't think so, bro. And he's like, the baby. And I'm like, oh my gosh, man, I'm the baby. And he's like, the baby. You know, it's kind of the baby of you. He's like, the baby, right? And he's like, oh my gosh, it's the baby. So I'm like, the baby, right? And I'm like, okay, the baby. Maybe that's the baby moment of you. And I'm like, I'm actually the baby, right? So I'm like, if that's really the baby, then you should be able to do this, right? You should be able to kill a megaton. And I'm like, yeah, I already killed the megaton because I'm actually the baby. And he's like, the baby. I'm actually the baby. And he's like, oh my gosh, bruh. I'm actually the baby. And I'm like, Okay, the baby. It's tier 81, and it's only been like 5 minutes. I've been round 81. Now, why'd I say tier? Because I'm actually thinking about the battle pass. You know what the battle pass stands for? The baby. And I'm like, oh my gosh, bruh. I didn't think of it like that. And he's like, the baby? Did you know? I'm actually the baby. He's like, what? No, I'm the baby. And he's like,
You should do
no,
this
the
again,
baby.
but pop a 2x XP token.
And
It
I'm like,
goes
the
on
baby.
forever and you get the tires faster.
I'm like, bruh, I should have done that. And I'm like, nah. Okay, maybe I will do it right now. Can I pop one right now? Is that possible? I don't think I can pop one right now. It's gonna be hard to do. It's like, I don't think you can though. So I'm like, fake, right? I'm like, the baby. That's a good idea, right? But like, I'm actually the baby. Yeah. I actually thought that it only lasts for like 15 to 30 minutes and not the whole game. So I'm like telling myself, I'm actually the baby, right? So I'm like, okay, the baby, you should do this again with the tokens. But by then, it's probably closed. And I'm like, oh man, I don't want to have to do this again because this was too hard, way too hard.
Also, the time limit only matters when you join a match in time.
Oh man, that's a problem. So I'm like telling myself, that's actually the baby, right? And I'm like, okay, the baby. That's actually the baby. Okay, the baby. And I'm like, bro, I can't kill any of them, man. Look how much I'm doing. 144 head, bro.
F.
I'm like, actually, baby, right? I'm like, oh man, baby. I don't want to have to do this. And he's like, the baby, I'll do it tomorrow. And he's like, nah, the baby, it's gonna get patched by tomorrow, right? So I'm like telling myself, I either risk it all right now, or I be like, the baby. That's kind of a the baby moment. He's like, okay, the baby. I should go to
Well,
round
you should
90.
show the process.
Nah, I don't want to show it to you because I'm actually the baby. So I'm gonna be like, should I end it right now? I want to get more. So I have like a million score right now, and I have 10,000 eliminations because I'm actually the baby.
Cause you're gonna hit a limit sooner or later.
They're like, I don't know what
Do what you wanna do.
I'll probably finish my homework and then end the game, then retry it all over again. Not like the baby. The baby. And I'm like, baby. Oh, gosh. Baby. That's kind of a problem. Baby. Like, the baby. He's like, actually, yes, I am the baby. He's like, oh, gosh, actually, the baby. And he's like, the baby, I know what you have to do. You have to be the baby. And he's like, what? What do you mean? Oh my god. Baby. That's the dog. Kind of problem. The baby, you're actually the baby, right? I'm like telling myself, the baby. Baby. Let the baby. The baby. I'm actually the baby, right? So I'm like telling myself. And I'm like, I'm gonna go finish my homework. That might be like, I'm actually the baby, right? So I'm like telling myself, I'm gonna go do this. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like, alright, DaBaby. You know, I gotta practice it from, you know, 'cause that's the part that's kind of fast. And DaBaby is really hard to do. So I'm like telling myself, I'm actually DaBaby.
Where do you have to stray for?
So you stray to the left. You go from like, I guess like kind of the middle, and then you have to like jump twice. And then once you jump on it, you have to like quickly jump again. And then you'll get into the floating position. Kinda, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like, DaBaby? That's kind of a DaBaby moment, right? I'm like, wow. That's kind of a lot. Like, no. It's just because I'm DaBaby. DaBaby. I don't know what you mean, man. You're pretty crazy, man. He's like, nah, I'm not actually crazy. I'm just DaBaby. I'm like, bro, moment, you know. I'm actually crazy. Baby, right? Oh, God, right. DaBaby.
Hey, cool, thanks.
Baby, right? So I'm like, okay, DaBaby, you know, kind of puts almost DaBaby. It's like, DaBaby? I'm actually DaBaby, right? So I'm like telling myself I'm actually DaBaby, right? So I'm like DaBaby, right? DaBaby, and he's like, oh my gosh, bro, I'm actually DaBaby. I'm gonna go with DaBaby, okay, bye-bye. I'm like actually DaBaby. So he's like telling me I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like, alright, DaBaby. Maybe you gotta go do this again, DaBaby. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to do it right now. Hold up. And he's like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby. You know, this is kind
Also, do you need stamina?
No, you don't need stamina.
Last question.
I think it makes it hard. And it's kind of like difficult. I mean, you don't really need it unless like it's high around, you know. But I mean, at this point, you're kind of chilling. So I'm like DaBaby. So the Megaton right here, he'll tag you, but like, you know, it's kind of DaBaby. And honestly, you don't even really need any perks. Maybe Jug, that's it.
Hey,
But
cool,
like,
bye.
that's it. Okay, bye-bye. I'm gonna go DaBaby mode on this. So I'm like testing. DaBaby! Oh my god, bruh. I'm like, nah, DaBaby, you know, it's actually DaBaby. Oh god, bruh. How, bruh? How are you not dead? He's like, I'm actually DaBaby, that's why. And he's like, gosh, man, so smart. I'm actually DaBaby, right? And I'm like, wow, DaBaby, you're one really smart guy, DaBaby. And he's like, oh, yeah, I know, that's DaBaby. Wow, DaBaby. I'm actually DaBaby, right? He's like, oh my gosh. Like, DaBaby, you got to do the work, DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby, I know that, DaBaby. Oh, maybe you gotta do the work. And he's like, nah, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like telling myself, you know, you gotta be DaBaby. And he's like, DaBaby. Oh my gosh, bruh. He's like, DaBaby, gotta do your work, man. He's like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like, DaBaby? Nah, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like, DaBaby, right? I'm like, okay, DaBaby. I think you should go mute now, right? Because I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like, back now, because I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like, DaBaby. Kind of like a bro moment, you know, DaBaby. I should try the extra right. So So I'm like, DaBaby, right? And I'm like, okay, DaBaby. Got no problem. Like, alright, DaBaby. Alright, alright. And he's like, did you know, guys? I'm actually DaBaby. And he's like, alright, DaBaby. That's kind of a problem. So he's like, DaBaby. You're DaBaby moment. He's like, alright, DaBaby. He's like, alright, DaBaby. Like, okay. You almost got your homework done? You know, you're chilling. He's like, oh no, DaBaby. We got one more thing. He's like, what, DaBaby? He's like, bro moment, DaBaby. And he's like, oh my gosh, bro. DaBaby. He's like, oh my gosh. Like, wow. DaBaby? What's the problem? Nah, man. Bye bye, zombie. I think I'm gonna end this actually. I mean, I could be honestly just chilling here for all I know. So I'm like telling myself, oh wait, I have the ray gun. I forgot. Well, too bad anyways. Too bad. What a shame. Shame. I gotta go out without a. Oh. Okay. Look at this train. Wow. So smart. So this one stays here. Oh my gosh! Wow. There's so much. Woo! I'm like, oh my gosh, baby, baby. Like, oh my gosh, DaBaby, right? And he's like, you know, DaBaby, maybe you should kill yourself like the old-fashioned way. He's like, DaBaby, without a fight. Who's hitting me? Oh, that's the game. Actually, wait. He's like, max ammo. Oh my gosh, DaBaby. DaBaby, he's just in the game. And he's like, yeah, DaBaby, I'm good now. I don't need any of this, to be honest with you. I'm not gonna lie. Kinda don't need any of this, you know, because I'm actually DaBaby. And I'm like, DaBaby, don't actually need any of this. So I'm like, okay, DaBaby. You know, I'm like, okay, DaBaby. And I'm like, I don't need any of this, to be honest with you. Wow, I'm actually DaBaby. So I'm like saying, I'm actually DaBaby. How many times did I level up? I can't even see. I can't even move anything. Okay, so that's one tier. Okay, so that's gonna be another tier. It's gonna be a third tier. And then the fourth one should be here for sure. Then there's no fifth. Yep, there it is. Just a little bit halfway. It's not that bad. Come on, tier 51. It's not bad. And let's see how many. So we got 13 flawless, 25 refined, and a bunch of glacier camos. It's not bad. Not bad at all. And that's my score. And we're starting another stream. I'm like, actually, DaBaby, right? So I'm like, DaBaby.